How long was it before you actually sat there in front of the polygraph test exam?
I'm guessing probably a week, but it felt like longer than that, Daniel. Every day was so long.
I can imagine. I can imagine. Now, kind of transitioning to that polygraph. You go in. Did they give you the questions they were going to ask beforehand?
Yeah, they actually did give us the questions ahead of time. There was actually 5 questions. I don't know why it says in those documents it was 4. There was actually 5 questions they wanted to ask, and then they would throw in questions that they knew that were that you couldn't lie on, right? Like, have you ever lost your temper? Obviously, everybody has lost their temper before, so you can't. And then you're going to say that you never lost your temper before, and then they know that's a lie, right?
Yeah.
So they could find your baseline on that. But all my questions centered around the death of the children. Are you an accessory to killing Lilly and Jack? Did you murder Lilly and Jack? All the questions were based on that.
I know the truth. I didn't kill Lilly and Jack.
Well, those are 2. What are the other 3?
What they did was reword the questions, differently, right?
Did they ask you, like, do you know where they're at?
No.
Huh.
No, they were just all on murder or accessory to murder. Do you know anything on the murders of Lilly and Jack? Are you accessory to killing Lilly and Jack? Did you murder Lilly and Jack? It's just the same questions, but just the orientation of the wording was just changed.
Understood.
But I didn't want questions like that. I said, let's do another polygraph, and that's have all the questions on disappearance. And I want everybody else polygraphed the exact same way.
So you suspect that they didn't ask Malaya about the disappearance aspect?
They wanted to rule out death as quick as possible. Because that would narrow everything down. Because if they knew that the children were deceased, that would completely narrow it down. They wouldn't have to ask them this on the disappearance.
So you take the polygraph test. Is there any questioning after the polygraph?
No, I actually did 3 polygraphs back to back. It took a total of 3 hours I was there for.
I didn't do anything. I know Malaya didn't do anything. I know my mother didn't do anything. Those are 3 people on the property. I mean, after the polygraph exams, they should have known right there. We didn't kill any of the kids, or we didn't kill the kids.
They told him the questions would be blunt and to the point, and when the polygraph machine started, it felt worse than anyone had prepared him for. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you get first-hand updates on this file as investigators test leads, labs return results, and the search for answers continues. The father at the center of this report asked early for a polygraph. He says he wanted to clear his name quickly and push investigators toward other lines of inquiry, not to shut down questions, but to force them to test everyone equally. That request set a chain of events that investigators and lawyers would later call unusual, because the local unit didn't have an examiner available who met both the family's and police's standards. Authorities arranged for a trained polygraph examiner to come from outside Canada. Flying in an expert from another jurisdiction signaled 2 things at once: the seriousness with which the father and his supporters took the test, and the determination by police to meet both legal and technical requirements so the testing would be defensible. For the family and for the public watching, that flight in of an examiner suggested that the polygraph would be handled professionally and that its results could carry weight with investigators. The father and his supporters publicized the move as proof of cooperation. Police framed it as one tool among many in a complex, multifaceted inquiry. The polygraph itself occurred roughly 3 weeks after the children's disappearance. That timing matters. By then, initial search activity was over, forensic samples were being processed, and investigators had shifted from immediate rescue efforts to a methodical review of evidence. In that context, the father told investigators he wanted any ambiguities about his actions resolved. The polygraph was not a private matter. It was a publicized, high-stakes attempt to draw a line under recurring suspicion aimed at him. At the same time, investigators were walking a procedural tightrope. Polygraphs are legally delicate. Many jurisdictions treat them as investigative aids, not as decisive proof in court. Police can use a past polygraph to deprioritize certain lines of inquiry, but courts typically expect corroborating physical or digital evidence before prosecutors proceed. The father knew this and, despite his desire for a definitive clearing, understood that the test was only one step in a larger evidence-gathering process. What surprised many observers was the focus of the test questions. According to the father, every principal question was framed on the assumption that the children were dead, and the test explored whether he had a role in killing them or helping to cover up a death. Those are blunt, prosecutorial-type questions that push a polygraph into the realm of adjudicating the most serious possibilities early in an investigation. The father said he and several others on the property, including Malaya, agreed to be tested. The tests of these household members were part of a broader police strategy to establish or eliminate immediate family involvement, or at least to measure degrees of culpability. For the father, the act of submitting to the test was a public assertion of innocence and a request that the investigative burden be shared. He wanted other people who had access to the property, who might have found potential evidence, or who had inconsistent accounts to undergo the same scrutiny. He passed his polygraph. That result was reported to him immediately, and he believes it materially reduced investigators' suspicion toward him. For an individual in his position, a past polygraph can have a very practical effect. Detectives reallocate resources, shift interview priorities, and sometimes narrow the list of persons of interest. The father says that after his test, the tenor of questions changed. Investigators focused less on him and more on other possible avenues. But it is crucial to remember what a polygraph is and what it is not. Many investigators and legal experts caution that polygraphs measure physiological responses, changes in heart rate, skin conductivity, and respiration that can correlate with deceptive answers but are influenced by many factors beyond dishonesty. Stress, fear, medication, or certain medical conditions can produce indications that mimic deception, and conversely, some people may pass despite withholding information. The father's passing certainly affected how investigators allocated attention, but it did not, and legally could not, close off further lines of inquiry into him should new physical evidence or corroborating digital records emerge. The father's account stresses how intense the experience felt. He said he was extremely nervous at the outset, particularly when examiners asked the blunt opening question that assumed the worst: whether he had been involved in the children's deaths. He described his body reacting visibly, a racing heart, sweating, even though he insists he was telling the truth. Polygraph examiners typically expect pronounced emotional responses during the control questions because those responses establish baselines for comparison. In this case, the examiners provided the 5 principal questions in advance, as is common practice, and used a set of control questions to set physiological benchmarks. Control questions are unrelated to the specific allegation but designed to produce a standard stress reaction that can be compared against responses to the relevant questions. The father says that knowing the exact wording beforehand both comforted and unnerved him. Comforted because it removed surprises, unnerved because it allowed him to anticipate the physiological reaction. To him, the whole process felt like a controlled lab experiment in which every breath and heartbeat were being measured against a carefully scripted set of prompts. He also describes undergoing 3 consecutive polygraph sessions over roughly a 3-hour block. Repeating similar questions in a single sitting is sometimes done to test the consistency of physiological responses. If the pattern of reactions shifts dramatically across repeated questioning, some examiners interpret that as meaningful. If the pattern remains stable, it may be judged consistent with truthfulness or with a stable emotional state. The father said the repetition was exhausting and that having been tested multiple times in one day induced more stress than he had anticipated. He recounts how examiners paused between sessions, recalibrated the instrumentation, and asked the same core questions in slightly varied wording. A procedural method aimed at reducing the chance that a subject could game responses through rehearsed control. From the father's perspective, the repeated tests were part of his attempt to be transparent. From the investigator's perspective, the repetition was a technical step to make the results more defensible. Following the tests, the father publicly and repeatedly asked that others be subjected to polygraphs as well, particularly individuals who claimed to have found potential evidence or who were first on scene. He argued that if the goal was to find the truth, then testing should be evenly applied. That request touches on both a practical and ethical point about modern investigations. Polygraphs are often viewed by families and the public as a tool of transparency and fairness, but investigators must balance that with legal prudence and operational strategy. Police are wary of using polygraphs as an automatic equalizer because the tests are not foolproof and because subjecting every person connected to a case to testing can consume resources better used on physical evidence collection and digital forensics. Still, the father's call for broader testing reflects a demand many families make when the spotlight ferociously narrows on a few individuals. If everyone is asked to submit to the same scrutiny, that perceived fairness can ease public distrust and reduce the chatter of accusation on social media. Not everything about the tests was public. The father says the RCMP withheld some results and would not release all testing materials. That's unsurprising from an investigative point of view. Authorities routinely withhold sensitive details to preserve the integrity of ongoing inquiries, to avoid compromising other lines of investigation, and to adhere to legal bounds around privacy and evidentiary rules. But it also breeds frustration. The father believes greater transparency, or at least a clearer explanation of why certain results are sealed, would reduce suspicion and restore a measure of public confidence. Investigators, however, answer that revealing raw polygraph data or procedural notes can tip off potential suspects and encourage them to tailor future statements or to destroy evidence. This tension between operational secrecy and public demand for openness is a common friction point in high-profile cases. Stepping back from personal testimony and the immediate drama of testing, there are clear takeaways. Passing the polygraph visibly shifted investigators' focus away from the father in the short term. It served as a practical triage tool that redirected some inquiry resources. The investigation's early questions, framed in many of the tests around the possibility of death, signaled an operational priority to determine whether a homicide had occurred, which in turn narrowed some investigative tracks. The father's insistence on wider testing underlines a desire for procedural fairness and public transparency. He wants anyone connected to key evidentiary moments to be tested to rule out complicity or to expose deception. The repeated and narrowly framed questions were designed specifically to test for involvement in homicide rather than more peripheral truths. That focused approach aimed to eliminate or confirm complicity in the most serious alleged outcome. And finally, the father's emotional state, his nervousness, fear, and the physical impact of the test highlight how stress colors both the polygraph experience and public statements made afterward. None of this dispenses with the nuance that polygraphs are imperfect instruments. Passing a polygraph does not prove innocence beyond doubt, nor does failing one prove guilt. What a properly conducted polygraph can do is reallocate investigative attention, push detectives to pursue other leads, or prompt further corroboration through physical and digital evidence. In this investigation, the father's test changed the priorities for some investigators, but it did not end scrutiny nor preclude future legal action if new evidence emerges. In closing, the father's account of multiple, consecutive polygraphs, flown in examiners, blunt homicide-focused questions, immediate results, and his public campaign for broader testing frames both the human drama and the procedural complexity of a modern missing persons inquiry. Polygraphs can shape perceptions and influence investigative allocation, but they are one component of a much larger puzzle that includes forensics, video analysis, witness corroboration, and careful legal process. The emotional intensity the father describes matters. It is not merely an anecdote, but a human reality that intersects with investigative technique and public trust. Investigators will continue to balance the search for objective proof with the understandable demand for transparency, and the public must remember that truth in this context is rarely instantaneous. It is built, slowly and painstakingly, on corroborated facts. Hold space for the family while insisting on procedural fairness and rigorous evidence gathering. We will continue to report verified developments and explain clearly what each new piece of information means for the investigation.